I'd like to welcome everyone to our first event of the year for the Business Council of Fairfield County. I'm Mike Hurling. I'm a partner at Findixson and Hurling here in Stamford, and I serve as the chair of the Fairfield County Information Exchange and a director of the Business Council. I want to thank you for all coming to our annual Economic Outlook, one that has been a cornerstone event for the Fairfield County Information Exchange in cooperation with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for over 10 years. The Information Exchange serves an important economic information and analysis role for the region, from research-based publications to offering public programs such as this. The goal of the Information Exchange is to explore, understand, and report on the issues impacting businesses in the region. My only real role up here is to thank a few people and then introduce Steve Gallucci. So I will launch into the thanks for those who have supported the role of the Information Exchange this year. The Ashforth Company, C.B. Richard Ellis, Connecticut Light and Power, Findixson and Hurling, Jones Lang LaSalle, O'Connor Davies, Pullman and Comley, and TD Bank. I would now like to introduce and thank Steve Gallucci of Deloitte, today's host, as we start this morning's program.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that introduction. And as Mike indicated, I am the managing partner of our Deloitte Fairfield County practice. It's a practice that has roughly about 1,200 people to it, and as part of a broader tri-state practice, as our economy is, approximately 9,000 people also. I'd like to quickly acknowledge and welcome Mayor Pavia, who sits here also and has a vested interest in the economy, as all of you do. Thank you, Mayor, for being with us this morning. As today's host, it's my pleasure to introduce Rae. Rae's insights and comments over the years have rung remarkably accurate and have guided not only the work of the Business Council, but many of us in attendance this morning. In light of all the recent jobs and economic activity that we all now monitor daily, I believe all of us are eager to hear this morning's speaker and her thoughts on where we are today, but more importantly, where we're headed. I am delighted once again to welcome Rae Rosen, a friend who is no stranger to our podium, and a colleague who has helped this region interpret the nuances within the tri-state economy and the Connecticut economy. As Vice President and Regional Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Rae is responsible for analyzing economic conditions and critical issues that affect the region's economy. Rae's district includes New Jersey, all of New York State, and our own Fairfield County. Excuse me. Note to self, turn off cell phone. Rae has an impressive record in economics and consulting, having worked as a senior economist at the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York and an economist at Merrill Lynch. So with that, please join me before my cell phone rings again in welcoming Rae Rosen to focus on the economic issues.
Yeah, my cell phone's permanently turned off. So first, an apology. We were supposed to be out here October 31st and November 1st, I guess, with our president. And we had a whole day planned where he was going to see the development in Fairfield County, some of what's happening in Bridgeport, and then the really exciting stuff here in Stamford, and Sandy hit, and we had to cancel. So we'll be coming back in the spring. The views I expressed today, this is our disclaimer, are mine and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. So we all speak for ourselves, not reflecting the system or the board in New York. After several years of bad news, I think the key takeaways here today are that the economy is recovering. It's gaining traction each quarter. And we know from all the research that's been done that if you have a financially led recession and it's caused by excess leveraging, it takes longer and it's harder to recover. And so that's why it's been a slow slog, but things are picking up. We have resolution to one of the key issues, the fiscal cliff, so that business people and consumers should be feeling more confident. And we have one more issue in March with the budget ceiling, and then we think that there'll be probably better growth in the second half of the year. moderate this year and maybe a little bit of pickup in the second half. So our unemployment numbers remain fairly high, and much of the correction you've seen when the paper reports that the unemployment rate has fallen is because people have dropped out of the labor force. They are discouraged and they're not looking, they've retired early, or they didn't enter it. So it's not necessarily an indication that the economy is doing markedly better. Consumer spending on durable goods has picked up. Most importantly, the housing recovery is gaining strength. And so we have a couple of few weak spots left. Business fixed investment is slow and slowed substantially over 2012. Manufacturing output declined in the second half of the year. So we've got some pickup on the consumer side, and housing, business sector is still soft. Now, from our viewpoint, inflationary pressures remain subdued, but we think that there are going to be episodes of food and energy prices that'll gain headline news, but they don't really reflect a pickup in the underlying trend of inflation. And lastly, our policymakers face really new and unfamiliar and difficult choices in the months going ahead. So I have a bunch of spider charts in this presentation today. What they do is let us compare various recovery periods, and they say, what's the growth been from the prior peak to where we are today? And along the bottom, they're quarters. So if you think of the economy as peaking for this cycle back in the fourth quarter of 2007, what happened after that? So the green line, the current cycle, it declines for a few quarters, and it picks up. But you can see that this is the slowest recovery in the post-World War II period. Now, I mentioned employment, and I think it's important to really focus on the fact that when you have a decline in the unemployment rate, it could come for good reasons or bad, or it's just not markedly one way or the other. So here you've got an employment to population ratio in green, and you can see that the number of people employed relative to the proportion of number of people who are 65 and under, it's just really dropped. We've just pulled people out of the labor force. And that's one reason the unemployment rate has dropped. And then another way of measuring the labor force participation rate, those are people who say, hey, I'm looking for a job and I have one, or I'm unemployed but I'm looking. Even that rate has dropped. So the first line, the green one, says people who just have quit looking. And the other one says, hey, I'm looking and I may or may not have a job. Both of those have declined. And when they decline, that helps boost or drop the unemployment rate artificially. So there has been some pickup, there's been some job growth, but it's not as good as the headlines would lead us to believe. Consumer spending has picked up. This chart and all the charts that follow when they have those little gray bars, those are recessions. The green line is real disposable income per capita, and it's growing, but you can see it's at a really low rate, so it's picked up. There's been some improvement, not a lot. And the only real spending that's going on is on durable goods. That would be light trucks and autos. Other than that, the consumer's pulled back. Now, the household obligation ratio, it sounds like a fancy term, but it just is a measure of leveraging. And we've got the gray bars for recessions. You can see that through 2007, people bought a lot of housing and they put a lot of money on those credit cards. So the debt to income ratios really rose, and now they've pulled back. They've paid down, they've deleveraged. It's principally reductions in mortgage balances, but it means that the consumer overall is in a position to spend when he or she feels comfortable again. And the most interesting thing is what's happening if we take the credit scores for everybody in the economy and we divide them into the top 20%, next 20%, and so on. Top 20% would be people with a FICO score of 800 or better. That's the red line. That is the only group that is adding to debt and putting more debt on credit cards. Every other group as a whole, with a FICO score of 800 or less, and I don't know about you, but I don't make that top group, they are pulling back and still deleveraging. They are not willing to put more money on those credit cards. And as I said earlier, the housing market has begun to recover. Multifamilies made the biggest gains. Those are those red lines, so they're coming up off the bottom. And there's been a slight pickup in single-family housing starts. So we've hit the bottom. There's been an improvement, but it's really slow. For existing homes in the single-family market, the two factors you could follow here would be the inventory that's available. At one point, we had a full year's inventory available. People weren't buying. Typically, the typical ratio should be 5 to 7 months. Well, now that inventory's come back in line with the sales rate. It's dropped. And the red line would be prices, the overall price index. You could say it's flat or picking up a little bit, but it's no longer declining. So again, we've reached a turning point in the housing market, and it's gradually becoming better. One of the things that's holding the housing market back is what we call household formations. So during the recession, people moved back in with parents, kids moved in with parents, sometimes brothers and sisters moved in with each other, and you had household formations contracting. Well, we've begun to have kids moving out again, people looking for homes, but it's much more difficult to get a mortgage. And we really don't want to go back to those conditions we had in 2005, 6, and 7, where anybody could get a mortgage without any check on your ability to pay. So you don't want to go back to that sort of free-for-all situation. It is more difficult. They're requiring harder down payments, somewhere in the 20 to 30% range. So households are going to rent. And the rent piece of the housing market has picked up sharply. And you can see that owner-occupied, those moving into a home when they purchase, it's sort of bumping along. It hasn't returned to its old growth rate. And that may be the situation for some time to come, that it's simply easier to move into a rental. I mentioned business fixed non-residential investment. Now we're back to these spider charts, so we can compare the different cycles. And you can see that although it's picked up, that green line at the bottom, it's still growing very, very slowly. Businesses are not confident about where the economy is going yet, and it may take some resolution come March before they feel sufficiently confident to start investing again and expanding plant and equipment. Exports are a bright spot. We're exporting not only to Europe, which is our traditional market, but to emerging markets in Asia. And they've done well, and we expect them to continue to do well. So they're a plus for the economy, along with the gradually improving consumer, the gradually improving housing market. One drag, which is atypical, is state and government and federal expenditures. And the current cycle, the green line, you can see was moving down in the recovery period, whereas most other cycles, you get a counter-cyclical impact. The economy's weak, and government spending picks up and sort of carries you along until things improve again. And that hasn't been the situation this time. State and local government revenues are picking up, but they still aren't where they were 4 years ago. And so there's still some contraction at the state and local level. And this will continue to be a drag on the economy as we go forward this year and possibly next. Well, if there's not that much demand from the consumer, principally autos and light trucks, then we're not going to be producing much. So industrial production, when our manufacturers are producing, it's close to that zero line. And if you pull out high tech and autos, it's really flat. I mentioned price inflation being subdued. So overall, you have the consumer price index, and it's running close to 2%, which is where we'd like to see it. But headline-grabbing news is frequently food or energy. So the CPI for food is in blue, and its measurement is on the right axis. So those percent changes are pretty large. If you look on the left-hand side, there's the overall index, and it's running somewhere around 2 to 3%, closer to 2. But those numbers on the right-hand side are large, and food price inflation has been in the double digits. But the reason we say that it doesn't have that much impact overall on the consumer price index is the weight in the index. The weight is only 14.2%. So if you think in your mind, what do you spend each week on food versus, or add it up for the month, versus your monthly mortgage payment, utilities, and the car, you're going to be closer to 14. So you see the price, it hits home every day, but it really isn't driving overall inflation. Now, right now, energy, the green line, is subdued, but it could spike up again because we import a large amount of our energy and it's not under our control. But again, energy is only 10% of that index. So they grab the headlines, but they don't really drive the index. And when we look at the TIPS, the inflation-adjusted bonds, which are a measure of inflation going forward, we continue to see that people expect prices to remain overall low in that closer to the 2% range. So here's the other drag on the economy. It's got a good side and a bad side. It provided resolution because there was so much uncertainty in the market. And in that sense, it was quite helpful. But there's some nicks to income here and to spending that I think many people aren't aware are going to hit this year. So first of all, we all got a gift for the last couple of years. We had a 2 percentage point reduction in the payroll tax. That's gone away, and we're now going to have that additional nick. Everybody gets it. There's a higher income tax for the high-income earners. I think what some people might not have realized is that there's going to be a different tax rate on long-term capital gains and unqualified dividends. Those go up. Most of these are hitting high wage earners, but overall it's going to pull money out of the economy. And if you remember those FICO scores of 800, I would suspect the bulk of them are in that high wage earner piece, so their taxes are going to rise significantly. In addition to the tax increases that are coming from the Taxpayer Relief Act, there are other tax increases that have come from the Health Care Act that was passed in 2010 and that only kick in this year. So for these, if you're a high wage earner, an individual making over $200,000 a year, you're going to have an increase in the health insurance tax on your income of almost a full percentage point. There's also going to be a 3.8% tax on adjusted gross income that exceeds $200,000 for the individual. And this investment tax is going to apply to, say, the sale of a home over anything that's over the exclusion that's already built in. So there are all these little taxes that are going to creep in that people might not have been aware of. And they are going to reduce the income that's available for consumer spending and slow the growth from what it could have been. Now, we're not saying there's going to be a recession, nothing like that. It's just that growth is somewhere closer to 2.5% rather than 3%, so it slows us down a little bit. So overall, our growth rate in the overall economy has returned to what it was prior to the recession. Those lines are parallel. But we haven't achieved the old levels. It's as if you took a 10% hit to your income 4 years ago, and now your income's growing every year again at 10%, but you're coming from a lower base. And that's what's happened to our economy. In terms of monetary policy, what we can do, the most important part is at the bottom line. We're going to keep the rates that we control low for the foreseeable future until the unemployment rate exceeds a certain target. Now, for the last couple of months, the last 4, it's been at 7.8%, so it doesn't look like we're going to hit 6.5 at any time soon. So that is our statement that's made publicly 8 times a year. You can read it. There'll be another one coming out in February. This is the last one. Exceptionally low range for what amounts to the foreseeable future. If we turn to Connecticut, Connecticut is, particularly Fairfield County and Connecticut, a little bit slower than what's happening elsewhere in the nation. This is the year-over-year growth rate in employment in the gray shaded area. That's for the U.S., and those lines represent Fairfield County and Connecticut. And you can see that the growth rate is typically less than that of the U.S., but we're a mature part of the country. You'd expect that. However, during this recovery period, things have lagged a little bit here, and they're picking up now, but it's lagged a little bit. This chart tracks the level of employment, excluding government, What you really want to take away from it is that there has been a little bit of a recovery, but the level of jobs is below what it was in the year 2000. So there's been an outright reduction in jobs here. Overall, real incomes have gone up. The composition of the job market's probably improved a little bit, less manufacturing and more, or less old-scale manufacturing, more high-tech, more services, more skilled services. But the level and number of jobs is lower. And here are the job changes that have occurred. Those green lines below the bars, below the 0 point, those are the jobs that were lost from the beginning to the end of the recession. And the yellow bars going up, that's the gains we've made since the recovery began. So the most interesting thing on this chart is that health and education, primarily health, grew right through the recession. Now it had a green bar, 12.1, and it's continued to grow. But we're not getting a lot of growth in the other sectors yet. And I think we should see some pickup in those as the year progresses this year. New York City has done better than most national rates in most sectors of the economy, and Fairfield County typically gets a spillover from that. So there should be some pickup there in professional and business services, financial services, as the year progresses. Another way to look at it, just for the most recent month that was reported, Connecticut didn't do so well overall compared to any of the other U.S. sectors, with the exception of, again, health and education, and that's almost all health, and information. Now, the Connecticut numbers probably won't do as well as Fairfield. Fairfield County has the proximity to New York, and that's a big plus for the county. So Fairfield County is in there. It's on the high side for unemployment. I don't think there's much of a takeaway from that. Unemployment rates have come down slowly. We've got some job growth. People in Fairfield County can commute out, and they do, to work in other parts of the country. Things will get better gradually as the year progresses. It's sort of right in line with the other areas in our district. New Jersey is worse. U.S. overall is a little bit lower, but those differences are probably, there's always measurement error, and most of those differences are well within the error of measurement, not any real difference. Overall, it's high, but it's getting lower, and it's getting better slowly. Home prices have picked up. This is the latest reported at the very local level that we have overall. We're not growing as fast as the nation, but I think you can see that the corner's been turned and things are not falling. They're picking up again. So overall, the picture's getting brighter slowly. And we expect that once we get through some of the issues related to the budget ceiling in the first quarter of this year, that we might see a little bit even better growth in the second half of the year for the economy overall. Given the slow rate of growth in professional and business jobs, office vacancy rates are rising in Fairfield, and it might take a while to pull that down. But again, if you see what's happening in the city and it's getting tighter and tighter, that usually presages a pickup here and in the surrounding markets. So that's it, but I'd be happy to take any questions you have.